My name is Maria Mattera, Scientific Director of the PR Consortium with CPATH, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Before we get to the presentations, I just want to start off with some housekeeping reminders. And T, I'm not seeing my little arrows there, so could you advance? Oh, there they are. Yep, thank you. Just want to start off with some housekeeping reminders. All attendee lines will be muted during the workshop, and the workshop is being recorded and will be available on our website in May. Also, later on, if you would like to ask a question during the question and answer period, please use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. Please note we will not be monitoring the chat box for content related questions, so please hold those questions for Q&A later, and then you can raise your hand and we'll call on you directly. Moving on to the disclaimer slide, just a reminder, the opinions and views presented are those of the individual presenters and not of the organizations they're affiliated with. So, like I said earlier, the goal of today's session will be to discuss using digital health technology to measure what matters. To achieve this goal, we will first hear an update on what the PRO Consortium's Chronic Heart Failure Working Group has been doing recently. Next, we'll hear from a case study, highlights of the wearable assessments in the clinic and home in Parkinson's disease, or the WATCH-PD study. We'll then move on to hear about digital health technology measures in Parkinson's disease and get a deep perspective. And our last presentation will discuss recommendations for defining and reporting adherence to digital health technology tools. After the presentations, we'll hear some remarks from our panelists with several FDA perspectives, and then finally move on to the question and answer portion of the session. Okay, so at this time, I'm pleased to introduce our participants for this session, and I'm going to ask all of our presenters and panelists for this session to turn their videos on at this time while I introduce you all. Give everybody a second to do that. Okay, so again, I'm Maria Mattera with the PRO Consortium. I'll be the moderator for this session, and I will be the first presenter as well. We will then hear presentations from Speck, my colleague at CPATH, Langel from Janssen, and lastly, Jessie Bakker from Signifier Medical Technologies, who's presenting on behalf of Digital Medicine Society. After our presentations, we'll get some additional perspectives from Michelle Campbell from FDA and Annie Saha from FDA. So thank you so much, presenters and panelists. We can all turn our videos back off now until after the presentations, and I'll remind you later to turn those back on for the Q&A. All right, so like I said, I will start us off today by providing an overview of the most recent chronic heart failure working group efforts. All right, first we'll just start with an outline to get everybody on the same page. I'll talk through background of the ongoing chronic heart failure working group efforts, discuss a little bit about our recent completed activities, and provide a summary of the concept elicitation study that was conducted, and then move on to a summary of the advisory panel member feedback on the proposed activity monitor metrics. We'll discuss some points for consideration and then move on to our remaining and next steps. So just to give a little bit of background, again, as a reminder, we've been talking about this in the past few workshops, but the Chronic Heart Failure Working Group has been very busy over the past few years, developing evidence for the qualification of 3 clinical outcome assessments for use in chronic heart failure clinical trials. 2 are patient-reported outcome measures, 1 for symptoms and 1 for impacts. And then we also have 1 activity monitor-based endpoint measure, and that will be more the focus of today's discussion. Letters of intent were submitted to FDA, and all measures were accepted into the COA qualification program back in April 2019. And then, as I mentioned, we've been very busy since then. In its response to the LOIs, FDA requested a qualification plan for each COA. So our main challenge related to the activity monitor-based endpoint measure has really been determining what variables from the activity monitor should be used to derive an endpoint that would reflect a meaningful aspect of physical activity to persons with CHF. And to help us answer this question, we've got several things that have been going on. We conducted a concept elicitation study to generate qualitative evidence regarding day-to-day physical activities that are important to those with CHF, and also investigating the dimensions reflecting how these activities are performed. In addition, a parallel observational study using an activity monitor that was funded by Amgen was conducted to understand the relevance of measure output from the device and really to provide data that we could use to evaluate the metrics measurement properties. In addition, a recent literature review was performed as an informal step just to really guide our overall efforts in general. And then most recently, an advisory panel was convened to get some important and critical feedback on the proposed metrics from some experts in the field. Okay, so again, for those of you who were in the workshop last year, this is a little bit of a repetition, but just to orient everybody again, we did conduct a consultation study. Interviews were completed with 31 participants by phone from 4 sites across the US, and those were completed back in December of 2020. The mean age of participants was 68 years old and majority were female. And this just shows we had diversity in NYHA, heart failure severity, as well as type. So in the course of these interviews, we were really trying to understand from participants what activities were important and meaningful in their lives. And so activities that were most frequently reported involved light to moderate physical activities, such as cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, self-care, and gardening. And then also, there was quite an emphasis on activities involving walking, so shopping, exercise, going to appointments, things in their everyday life. When asked to rate the importance of key activity dimensions for the 3 activities they found most meaningful, people really reported that fulfillment and completion of a task was the most important thing. Speed of activities was rated as least important. So ratings for duration, frequency, and intensity were the dimensions suggested for consideration as concepts of interest. As you can imagine, of course, fulfillment of a task cannot really be measured by a wearable device. Participant narratives included multiple discussions of distance walked, suggesting it's another important concept to consider. So then we wanted to move from the meaningful physical activities that were reported in these qualitative interviews to more kind of concrete activity monitor based metrics. So based on results from all the evidence we had compiled to date, it was decided that advisory panel expertise would be really important to enable the working group to move forward, identify specific metrics that could capture clinical benefit and inform potential activity monitor based endpoints in CHF treatment trials. So we moved forward to form an advisory panel. The Chronic Heart Failure Working Group and CPATH were asked to provide recommendations of potential candidates. We really wanted to get the right people at the table, certainly. So looking for candidates with relevant experience in the identification of clinically meaningful activity monitor-based outcome measures, particularly in the context of drug development. So we did go through quite a process. 21 candidate names were provided, and we did take the bulk of several working group meetings to discuss merits of each potential candidate, and we really did seek a balance of technology expertise as well as clinical expertise. So after all of that, 5 advisors were invited and participated, and those individuals are listed here, and they do have a varied expertise in development, testing, validation, and use of wearable device technology in clinical trials. And we were lucky to have them all participate in 2 advisory panel meetings. So the 2 meetings took place, one in December and one just most recently in March, a little bit of different goals and objectives. The first meeting in December, the goal of which was really to review the existing evidence, including the qualitative study findings, and discuss potential activity monitor metrics that would best capture the meaningful aspects of physical activity among these people with CHF. Then we did a lot of work in between, and then we moved forward to our most recent meeting in March, where we wanted to align on preliminary rankings of the proposed metrics based on their ability to best quantify a meaningful outcome and really kind of move in a more concrete direction. Pre-read materials were sent to the advisory panel members before each meeting with a request for feedback to inform the discussion during each meeting. And then, as mentioned, between the first and second advisory panel meetings, the working group did hold bi-monthly meetings to debrief on the learnings from the first meeting and get aligned on the plan for the proposed metrics to be discussed in the second meeting. Okay, so in the first meeting, again, taking what we learned from the qualitative patient participant interviews, advisory panel members discussed potential metrics to reflect key concepts identified as important in those qualitative interviews. So some of the main things that were discussed are, distance as relevant for certain activities where it applies, such as walking and step counts, the time and duration of activity using activity counts, frequency of activity, any activity intensity, activity type, and also sleep parameters were discussed as well. In this meeting, advisory panel members also talked about potentially appropriate device wear location and explored whether we can identify and define a metric that is truly device agnostic. So then, as mentioned, a lot of work was done between meeting 1 and meeting 2, and we really were trying to whittle down the concepts and potential metrics into at least a shorter list, if we could, that we would put in front of the advisory panel to get their specific feedback. We expected that proposed metrics would likely be related, but also that further reduction of the number of proposed metrics was expected. We don't want to go in with too much or too little, and some might be more specific, some might be more exploratory, that sort of thing. So based on the discussions, concepts no longer under consideration following the first advisory panel meeting included activity type, activity intensity, sedentary time, and sleep parameters, for some varying reasons here below, as well as also linking back to the qualitative interviews as well, and what participants reported as important as well. Okay, and here's just kind of a draft list of some minimum data requirements of the proposed metrics. Certainly we're not going to spend much time on this today, but we expect that the final metrics would be derived from raw acceleration data. We're expecting it to be applicable to wrist-worn devices and non-device specific, and certainly based on data acquired from devices that would be calibrated to industry standards. Okay, so based on review of the relevant evidence to date, 2 sets of related metrics were proposed offering complementary information. One set based on step counts to capture physical activity related to walking that we found was very important to most participants. And a second set based on activity counts to capture general activity, which may include walking, but also would capture the non-stepping activities as well. So here was the list of 9 metrics that we kind of brought into the second advisory panel meeting. Again, some maybe would be exploratory. So total number of steps per day, cumulative, the longest duration of continuous steps, number of steps in the 30 minutes that contain the most steps per day, not necessarily continuous, as well as number of steps in the 6 minutes that contain the most steps per day, not necessarily continuous, just trying to get at kind of different timeframes. And then the metrics based on activity counts were proposed as total activity counts per day, cumulative, as well as the cumulative total active time per day, longest duration of continuous activity, and then these last 2, the activity counts in the most active 30 and 6 minutes per day, not necessarily continuous. So again, some may be exploratory, that sort of thing. So the advisory panel members were sent this list, were asked to provide preliminary rankings of the proposed step and activity related metrics based on their ability to best quantify a meaningful outcome prior to the meeting. These rankings were discussed at length, and in the course of the meeting, some people even changed their thoughts on certain things based on how the discussion proceeded. Some initial findings we came away with, or that longest duration of continuous steps was something that everybody endorsed. Additional exploratory metrics may include number of steps in the X amount of continuous minutes that contain the most steps per day. Again, people are looking at, are more interested in this continuous activity. It kind of links back to those qualitative interviews where people really wanted to, kind of fulfill a task, carry out a task, kind of do something in a continuous fashion. The discontinuous metrics were not endorsed as highly as the continuous ones. So just moving on, we realize that there's still questions that need to be answered, but other points for consideration are that we acknowledge at this point that there are some challenges with definition or conceptualization of this continuous stepping. We need to determine how to define continuous. What happens if somebody is, continuous for a bulk of it and it stops because they're talking to a friend or something like that. So some good examples came up in the course of the advisory panel discussion. We'd also need to account for those with shuffling type walking behaviors where it's not as crisp or clear of an actual step. We still may want to account for non-walking activity, again, to get at some of those other activities that were, self-care or gardening, things like that. Although inconclusive at this point, may want to consider retaining at least one activity-related metric, even if it's exploratory, such as total activity counts per day or longest duration of continuous activity. We do want to focus on something that will truly reflect clinical benefit. And another aspect will be to determine the most appropriate wear time and what makes sense there, depending on the metrics that are decided upon. So lastly, we do have remaining steps. The first of which would be alignment among the CHF working group on the metrics to move forward. Then we'll plan to set up an interim meeting with FDA to confirm the proposed metrics and really get some feedback from FDA colleagues. Then move on to development of an analysis plan to generate novel algorithms, if that's found to be necessary, as well as a separate statistical analysis plan for data analysis. Next, it would be development and submission of a qualification plan to FDA, and moving on to, again, if appropriate, developing novel algorithms for any chosen metrics. And then moving on to analysis of the device study data to evaluate measurement properties of the chosen metrics. And then finally, submission of the full qualification package to FDA. And that is it. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Speck, for your presentation.
All right, thank you, Maria. So it's an honor to be able to give this talk on behalf of collaborators, a few of which I know are attending today. And I'm happy to be able to do this in April, which is Parkinson's Disease Awareness Month. So this is a talk on a qualitative study to generate content validity evidence to support the use of digital health technologies among people with early Parkinson's disease. The talk's going to include a brief background on DHT in Parkinson's disease, FDA's DHT draft guidance, and then the remainder of the talk is really going to focus on the WatchPD study. So that's the wearable assessments in the clinic and home in Parkinson's disease. Background on the study overall, and then focusing specifically on this qualitative sub-study that we're doing, sharing with you the objectives, methods, and then some key takeaways. So the topic of digital health technology in Parkinson's disease is something of great interest, and we're seeing that interest from a multitude of stakeholders. There's work being done in the academic space, trying to gain patients' perspectives of the use of DHT. We see that there's discussion in public-private partnerships. And there's also a regulatory perspective on, what the future of DHT is going to be in Parkinson's disease, and whether it is something that can help measure drug efficacy in clinical trials. In late December of 2021, FDA issued a draft guidance on DHTs in clinical investigations. And one of the parts of that draft guidance that's of particular relevance and importance to us involved with the WatchPD study is this element on novel clinical endpoints, and the emphasis that the principles that guide the development of these novel endpoints based on DHT are really the same principle and standards for development of any other novel endpoint. And what's critically important is that sponsors should be getting input from the multitude of stakeholders, first and foremost, that being patients, and generating the evidence that's necessary to demonstrate that an endpoint is clinically meaningful reflection of how a participant feels, functions, or survives. So an integral collaborator in WatchPD is the Critical Path for Parkinson's 3DT initiative. So the Critical Path for Parkinson's Consortium is one of the many pre-competitive public-private partnerships that's led by CPAP. And within CPP, there's a digital drug development initiative, the 3DT initiative. And this was launched in 2019 as a dedicated effort aiming to advance the regulatory maturity of DHTs for use in Parkinson's disease clinical trials. One of the key focuses is the use of DHTs to aid in the measurement of Parkinson's disease onset and progression. And as I said, this initiative has been very actively involved in the Watch PD study. So a brief overview of the Watch PD study for you. So this is a multi-center perspective, longitudinal digital assessment study of disease progression in subjects with early untreated Parkinson's disease. Study period was 12 months, and baseline visits happened between July 2019 and December 2020. So from that, you learn that our final participants going through completed in December 2021. The population of focus was 82 participants with early untreated Parkinson's disease. There was also 50 controls that were recruited and participated in the data collection as well. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're focusing on those folks with untreated Parkinson's disease. Average age, 63 years old, pretty good 50-50 balance of male and female, or close to it anyway. The population was, the vast majority were white, and the length of diagnosis on average is 10 months. So the primary objective of this observational study was to compare the ability of objective sensor-based measures and subjective clinical examinations to characterize symptom progression among these participants. So data collection included standard clinical assessments and then these novel digital tools that were used to objectively measure motor and cognitive function. Following baseline enrollment in that visit, participants did go into the clinic for visits at months 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12, and then did twice monthly at-home assessments. And it's these at-home assessments that we're focusing on here for our purposes. And that's what we're looking at on the screen here. So participants interacted at home with an iPhone and an Apple Watch for data collection. They did a mobile test battery twice monthly, and that battery included self-reported symptoms, cognitive psychomotor tasks, instrumented motor tasks, and then passively, there is also data collection occurring with the Apple Watch. What you're seeing on the screen, these are screenshots of what these tasks looked like for the participant. So the objectives of this qualitative sub-study were to understand from the patient perspective the relevance and comprehensiveness of these performance outcome measures that they were completing that were being administered via the digital health technology. And essentially what we're trying to do is generate the evidence needed to demonstrate content validity in order to have regulatory support of these COAs. So as far as the methods, a subgroup of CPP 3DT members that included academics, industry representatives, and people living with Parkinson's were involved in designing this qualitative study. And importantly, we also had active engagement and received advice from an FDA representatives. I just want to highlight the involvement of the people living with Parkinson's disease. So from day one, they were part of this subgroup and attended our very first meeting, initiating discussion and what direction we wanted this to go. They were involved in contributing to the protocol, contributing to the interview guide. As I said, attended every single meeting. And prior to our IRB submission, we did practice the interview content with them and gain their input, and we were able to make some modifications based on their input before we did our IRB submission. So it was just absolutely critical to have them involved, and very proud of that effort. Purpose of sampling was used to recruit 40 of the 82 participants that participated in Watch PD. They were recruited within 1 month of their 12-month data collection. We did allow them to participate up to 2 months, but I think pretty much most everybody was recruited within the 1 month. The purposive component was largely based on male-female balance, with then some attention paid to whether or not any had initiated therapy within their 12-month data collection. The semi-structured interview guide that was used had 2 parts. So first part was an open-ended symptom mapping exercise, which we could give a whole talk just on that alone. It was a very neat, novel technology that was used for that. And then part 2 was cognitive interviewing techniques necessary to demonstrate understanding, relevance, and comprehensiveness of the tasks. These interviews were conducted virtually. So the participant had to have a computer with a camera. So they were able to not just see the interviewer, but see the screen that the interviewer was using for this symptom mapping exercise. So what we have on the screen here is an example of the scripted cognitive interviewing content. So what the participants saw when they were being asked about this is just the screenshot of the tasks. They did not see the interview script. That was just for the interviewer. But the important thing to highlight here is that the way we went through this is similar, if not exactly how you would do this with a patient-reported outcome measure. You go through every item in that pro measure and you debrief with them to be able to understand that they understand what they're being asked and that they find it to be relevant and important to the measurement of the symptoms that they're experiencing. So the first thing we asked them to do was to, in their own words, explain to us what the task was asking them to do. Then we wanted to know what Parkinson's symptoms do they experience that would be related to completion of this task. Was the task similar or relevant to tasks in their daily life, and how so? And then finally, do they believe that completion of this task was important to measuring the progression of their Parkinson's disease? And if not, why not? So some key takeaways, I think, from this work, the role of DHTs in peripheral measure administration is evolving. I can't even say how many talks I've seen on that just this year that I've attended or at least seen coming through our email blasts. And it's critical that demonstrating that digitally derived endpoints are fit for purpose, and that needs to remain a focus. We believe the content validity evidence generated from this qualitative study is essential to achieving regulatory support. And our unique approach of doing this through a pre-competitive consortium ensures the involvement of all the relevant stakeholders, particularly patients. And not just that, but leveraging collaboration to get this work done efficiently and to be able to really share our findings. So I want to acknowledge all of those that have been involved with the CPP3DT initiative. This has involved CPATH, government and regulatory agencies, patient and research organizations, importantly, the people living with Parkinson's, and a number of critical scientific advisors as well. So with that, I will now hand over the presentation to Kai.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, and hello, this is Kai. And that's a really great segue into my talk. So let me first of all start by sharing my gratitude for the invitation and a bit of history as well. So I've been operating in the e-class space really since the year 2000. So one of the early pioneers in this space, and one of the early experiences I had was to be one of the original members of the EPRO Consortium. And that was really quite formative in my own career in the pre-competitive space. And that kind of really set me on this path where I really became very passionate about collaboration and driving things together. And that really led us to starting this deep initiative. So I'm here to talk about digital health technology measures in Parkinson's disease, and I'll use Parkinson's disease as an example, But what we're really onto here is something quite a bit bigger. And I wanted to introduce this deep initiative, which is all about unlocking this new science with the power of these digital health measures. There's a lot more to be gained by using these measures to help science and drug development and clinical care and many other things as well. So DEEP stands for Digital Endpoint Ecosystem and Protocols, and it's all about advancing the entire ecosystem in how it's working with these novel measures, and all of this is new to us. So we are trying to do whatever we can to help advance the field as a whole. So our high-level problem statement is here. I believe that this digital measures ecosystem is still very early on in its growth journey. Despite billions of venture funding being poured into digital health, the utilization of these tools in clinical trials, drug development is still very early on. There are many pockets of greatness. We heard some of them today, but a lot of this work is still being very scattered. There's great technologies out there, but it's very hard to connect all of these different things in meaningful ways. We need to do more to bring it all together in meaningful ways to really get the benefits out of it. On the right-hand side, I say that the utilization of these technologies is really not optimized today, and that really limits our ability to directly measure how patients function. And with many of these diseases, especially Parkinson's disease as an example, the impact of the disease on how patients function is tremendous, and we need to be able to better measure those things directly, and that's where the value of these different solutions come to life. I will give you a specific example of that today. Hopefully that will help illustrate the true value and power of these kinds of technologies. The good news is that we are really in this new era of drug development. There's many trends around us that are driving us forward. Medicine is becoming more personalized all the time, where we can individualize treatments to better target the specific issues that the individual humans are suffering from. There's a big trend to move drug development into more patient-centric environment, where we need to be able to measure things that matter to patients the most. We've heard about that thing today, where we really need to be able to measure things that touch patients' daily lives, at home, at work, and things in their daily lives, not in the clinic, like we're used to in the past. Then we have the decentralization of clinical trials, driven by the pandemic and other things as well, where again, more activity is moved away from the clinic into different environments where we need to be able to measure things remotely. And again, these digital measures add a lot of value in that kind of operational model as well. And collaboration is really key to this transformation. There's a lot of work to be done. This is far bigger than any one organization. So I'm all about helping connect the dots between different parties to move us forward together. So all of these trends really are putting collaboration and patients at the center of all of that. So to address all of that, we have really created DEEP as a holistic solution to address what we believe are the most significant barriers to adoption. So number one, we have an asset and standards catalog where we can publish access to different building blocks, whether they're standards, technologies, data, algorithms, evidence, and things like that, regardless of where they come from. We already heard that a lot of these solutions come from public-private collaborations, from the tech community, from academia, and so on. So here we want to connect all of those different things together so that we can all benefit from all of the great work that we are collectively doing. Today, that is extremely difficult because all of this stuff is all over the place, not very well connected. Then number two, we want to really bring a new infrastructure into how we are doing collaboration. We want to make it easy for parties to come together to develop new measurement standards. We heard some of that work today. We want to really be able to do that kind of thing at scale. This is almost, we've developed a technology platform that looks almost like a Kickstarter platform for making these collaborations happen. It comes with a legal framework, so you don't have to be a legal expert, an IP expert to be able to move into collaboration, because we have tried to standardize those different aspects of the different contributions access rights to results, and all of that, so that this becomes as easy as possible, so we can move people to the starting line as quickly as possible. And then we have the services ecosystem and these different protocols that we have developed, so that the work that we all do would be done in a more harmonized and consistent way. So that today I will do a brief demonstration of the asset catalog. I don't really have time to get into the other aspects, but happy to connect with you afterwards to do that. So let me move into the demonstration here, and this will give you hopefully a better sense of what I'm talking about and help paint a picture. So we have indeed created a technology platform to do all of those different things that we are currently in the process of externalizing, so that this can become something that can really truly serve the community as a whole. But it's something that Janssen has initiated, but really working extensively with other collaborators, including the FDA, to align the thinking and make sure that this indeed does what it's supposed to be doing. So let me give you this example of around Parkinson's disease and do a bit of a deeper dive into that. So I can now search for different diseases. We are using the ICD-10 classification system here. So we have 1,900 well-defined diseases in the system. So we can be quite specific about what is it that we're looking for. So within Parkinson's disease, there's many different things that we could measure, like dyskinesia, one of the key aspects of the disease. Motor activity, of course, a big aspect of the disease. Tremor is something that patients keep suffering from. So we can go and explore these different meaningful aspects of health that have been documented to be key aspects of each individual disease. If I had gone to a different disease, you would see a different list of aspects of health that include things that we could measure. Now, many of these different categories of concepts of interest may include one or more concepts that we could directly measure. So for example, in physical activity, there's 3 different interests, the concepts of interest that have been defined to be part of this catalog. In the tremor, we have involuntary muscle movement and 3 different kinds of concepts of interest that I could measure in there. And if I want to know what they are, I could go to this context view and find the definition of the different concepts of interest that could be measured with the brief description and including the supporting evidence that is often the type of patient-facing concept elicitation kind of evidence that really help us understand why is it that these concepts of interest have been listed and not something else, and so on. We can try to understand the relative importance of those to patients and so on. So here we have duration of symptoms, severity, and tremor type, where we can distinguish between different types of tremor and so on. So that's how we can standardize and publish those definitions of different measures and so on. Once we have figured out what is it that we want to measure in a research setting or otherwise, the next question then becomes, well, how can I measure that? What are the potential modalities by which I could measure one of these involuntary muscle movement concepts of interest? So that's where we've introduced what we call a target solution profile, which is basically a standard for that particular modality by which something could be measured. In this example, there's only one modality that we have cataloged, but in the physical activity category, we have 3 different modalities by which we could measure physical activity. So we have something that's based on a wireless motion sensor, and then we have another category based on activity monitors, and the third one that's based on something different. So 3 different modalities measuring the same thing, but using very different techniques of doing that. And if I want to know more about this particular modality and understand how does it function, I can go to the Stack view, which is basically exposes the anatomy of that particular measurement solution. It starts with the definition of what we are trying to measure. It then defines the technology agnostic component. So in this particular case, this modality is about using 2 different sensor types to measure both accelerometry and electromyography. It produces 2 different raw data sets, and then it uses a feature extraction algorithm that needs to be fed with those different raw data streams to develop the kind of health data we're interested in. And then we have some evidence requirements for these solutions. So we don't call out a specific brand of technology here. It's just a description of the different components that would need to be part of this particular modality. if it was a different modality, those components would be different, and so on. In this case, we have only one solution that fits to that category. But if I look at these other things, for motor activity and physical movement measurements, we have 4 different brands of technologies that we have cataloged with all of their own evidence and different algorithms and sensor technologies and so on. But I really wanted to focus on this tremor one and this specific solution from Adamant Health, because this is really a very nice example. So when I have the Adamant Health solution selected, I can look at the stack. And this time the stack is a technology-specific stack. So we now have the specific components from this particular company, so they describe what kind of sensor technology they use. And I can inspect that in detail. I can see what sort of performance requirements this component has, and how does this particular component meet that. So here we have a performance requirement for the temperature range that this device meets, and it has other requirements as well. And I can see how does this particular component meet that. I can then also inspect the raw data. So if I want to know more about what kind of data are they working with, and how are these different data streams described, so I have more information about that. I can look into the algorithms. So this helps me understand how do the algorithms work, what sort of performance requirements we have for that algorithm, how well does it need to be able to measure or extract information from those data streams, and so on. And then what sort of health data comes out of it. What is it really that this device or this solution is measuring? So again, there's more information there. And I can see, for example, that this solution can provide a symptom forecast. Again, something that would be very, very relevant for the patients and helps really illustrate how this solution can be differentiated from just measuring the movement. So through these EMG measures, we can actually understand why the patient is having the motor symptom they're having. And we can even predict the motor symptoms before they would be measurable based on actigraphy sensors alone. So we can actually see it coming before we can measure the actual movement. So that kind of shows how powerful these measurement solutions can be. They can go well beyond measuring movement to really understand why something is happening and not only what is happening. So that's really extremely clever for me. And then we have the different evidence documentation, again, analytical validation to understand how well the algorithms work, what evidence does this company have about how well their solution performs, and whether this is really fit for purpose to use in a clinical trial. We can see what kind of clinical validation evidence they have, usability evidence, and other things like that to really understand the solution in depth. So that's how we can catalog definitions of the different measures. We can catalog and document the different modalities by which we can measure some of these things, and help researchers find fit-for-purpose solutions with all of the supporting evidence that is required for the use in clinical trials and other settings in a single catalog. And these solutions can come from any kind of place. We can consistently harmonize and catalog them in this way to make them more easily discoverable by all kinds of different parties, and we can then collaborate to enhance them, to validate these solutions, to approach the regulators for acceptance as a consortia instead of individual companies trying to do all of that on their own. So there's tremendous power in this kind of a shared catalog network, which I think can really move us forward as an ecosystem where we can bring parties together and components together to develop these fit-for-purpose solutions for trials and beyond. So we're extremely pleased and proud of this work, and we are seeking the participation and collaboration of many different parties, including the Critical Path Institute, in helping move the field forward and really mature our ecosystem, bring scalability into digital measurement standards and all of that. So we're also collaborating with CDER and other parties to really connect all the dots and the great work that everybody's doing. So let me leave it there. Happy to answer any questions later, either in this forum or privately. But hopefully that was of interest, and thank you very much for giving the platform for me once again. And let me then hand it over to Jessie.
Thank you, Kai. Can you all hear me now? I apologize.
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So my name is Jessie Bakker. I am presenting today on behalf of the Digital Medicine Society, specifically regarding our recent recommendations for defining and reporting adherence to digital health technology tools. All right. I apologize. I'm having a few technical difficulties here. I don't know whether I have the option to forward the slides. All right. Is someone able to advance the slides on my behalf? Thank you so much. Okay, we'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. All right, so as I'm sure this audience is very well aware, suboptimal adherence can sometimes be the key cause of a failed clinical trial for various reasons, but most obviously the impact that it has on missing data. Advance, please. Up until recent years, adherence, particularly to drug-based interventions, have been a challenge to measure. We've been limited to things like self-report, pill counts, pharmacy refill rates, and biomarkers, each of which have their own various limitations. Advance, please. Connected sensor technologies, however, now represent a potential solution to measuring adherence accurately, objectively, and continuously, meaning throughout somebody's participation in the clinical trial, with minimal burden to the participant themselves. Advance, please. Sorry, that's going to become a little tedious. All right, best practices for measuring and reporting adherence to digital health technologies have up until recently been a little unclear. Recommendations have mainly focused on improving study design and reporting quality rather than focusing on adherence. Advance, please. So the overall goal is, of course, to maximize adherence within a clinical trial. Advance. Our intermediate step, obviously, is to take a bit of a step backwards and understand the determinants of adherence, and then advance ultimately to understand, to adequately measure and report adherence as a first step. So at the moment, we are focusing on the left-hand side, which is gathering the evidence in order to understand the problem and ultimately work to address the problem. Okay, so the Digital Medicine Society recently pulled together a group of experts to conduct a systematic review in order to identify studies that have used at least one biomet to measure adherence to data collection procedures, so adherence to the biomet itself, or adherence to the study intervention. Just as a reminder, the definition of a biomet has been defined previously as a connected digital tool that processes data captured by mobile sensors using algorithms to generate measures of behavioral or physiological health, including adherence. I'll take a quick pause here and just mention that we are aware that there are several inconsistent definitions and terms out there, including adherence, compliance, usage, concordance. These are often used interchangeably. We are referring here to adherence as the extent to which the digital tool was used per the study protocol. So our second objective was to describe the methods used to measure adherence. And we put some definitions around that. Specifically, we were looking for adherence reported quantitatively as a non-surrogate measure, meaning an unequivocal reflection of actual usage, and a sensor-based measurement, meaning no element of self-report, clinician interpretation, or manual data manipulation at any step. Advance, please. Our third objective was to compare the definitions of adherence reported in the recent literature. Advance. And in doing so, we would be well positioned to describe the current state of the art, allowing us to compile a set of recommendations that we believe will address some key gaps that we observed with regards to measuring and reporting of adherence. Okay, so we started with a set of 940 peer-reviewed manuscripts, of which 840 were excluded from our systematic review for the reasons you see listed, meaning that we ended up with 100 individual papers, which collectively reported adherence to 110 individual biomets or individual tools. And they fell into various categories, as you can see, including wearables, smart clothing, blood pressure monitors, smartphones, etc. We focused our search on the 5-year period immediately preceding the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was obviously associated with a major change in how these types of digital tools have been implemented. Okay, so the figure that I'm about to show you is fairly complicated, so I'm going to take it step by step. The first thing we did was take our 110 biomets and place them into 3 different groups. Firstly, we defined passive biomets. These are tools that are designed to be used continuously, such as fitness trackers or other similar wearables. Our second category was session-based biomets, and these were, as the name implies, designed to be used during sessions. And so an example of this would be connected exercise equipment, where the duration of use has some actual meaning. And finally, our third category was task-based biomets. These are those that are designed to be used as a one-off task, such as connected weight scales. The key differentiator here is that the duration of use for task-based tools has no meaning. The duration of which somebody taking their weight in the morning is meaningless in terms of adherence. So the next thing we did was take, for each of our 110 biomets, the primary definition of adherence. We identified 37 unique definitions of adherence across those 110 tools, and we created 3 categories. The first one that you're seeing here is duration of use, measured in minutes per day, hours per night, or something along those lines, an actual metric of time. The next category of adherence definitions was the number of measurements. So examples of this would be number of tasks completed or number of days with usage. Finally, we have adherence reported as a categorical variable, so some kind of threshold-based definition. Examples of this would be the percentage of participants with usage over, say, 10 hours per day, or the percentage of participants who complete at least 2 measurements per day or something like that. I hope what is clear here, you can advance, is that over on the left, time-based metrics of adherence is the highest resolution of adherence data, whereas over on the right, categorical variables are the lowest resolution of adherence data. You can advance. Okay, so here we have, sorry, if we could just go back one. Here we have adherence reported as 3 different categories, and within those categories, 3 different types of tools, therefore 9 categories in total. Okay, let's go. Over on the left, okay, each of these colored bands that you're seeing here represent unique definitions of adherence within each category. So let's take the first column just as an example, passive biomets. We have 32 digital tools that are passive for which adherence was reported as the duration of use. And of those 32 tools, we noted that 28 of them reported the exact same definition of adherence. Across all 3 categories that you're seeing there, we have 52 tools in total, and the same definition of adherence was reported for 92% of them. So there was a lot of consistency with the way that adherence was reported when it was reported as the duration of use, the highest resolution. Advance, please. Great. So in the middle here, we have adherence reported as the number of measurements. And hopefully it's clear that we're seeing a little bit more heterogeneity creeping in here. Let's look at the passive biomets. Again, just as an example, we identified 16 tools that were passive biomets for which adherence was reported as the number of measurements. And across those 16 tools, there were 7 unique definitions of adherence. Finally, over on the right-hand side, I hope what is now a very clear pattern. When adherence was reported as a categorical variable, we had a lot of heterogeneity. So again, just focusing on the passive biomets, we have 21 tools falling into that category, 19 different definitions of adherence. So almost all of the tools in this group had definitions of adherence that were not directly comparable from study to study. Across all 3 bars on the right-hand side, we have 37 tools in total and 25 unique definitions of adherence. So I know that's a complicated figure. We can advance one more time. The take-home message here is that the heterogeneity of the adherence data increases substantially as the resolution of the adherence data decreased from left to right. Okay, so throughout our systematic review, we identified 3 key gaps and came up with a series of recommendations that we believe, if implemented, would address those gaps. The first is that 30% of the studies were excluded during our systematic search because they did not report quantitative adherence. So obviously, recommendation number 1 is that we encourage investigators to develop and use Biomets to capture sensor-based adherence data, in addition to whatever the primary purpose was. So for example, in a drug development trial that's using, say, a wrist-worn accelerometer to estimate total sleep time, we would encourage those investigators to report total sleep time, but also report the adherence to the tool itself. Recommendation number 2 is to collect and report adherence data that are a direct reflection of actual use rather than a surrogate. And I'll just take a moment to explain what I mean by that. As an example, smart pill bottles, which have become more widely used in recent years, will send a Bluetooth signal every time the lid of the pill bottle is removed. This is a major advancement and a huge step forward from things like self-report and refill rates, which are a little more crude in terms of their measurement of adherence. However, it doesn't tell you whether or not the person actually swallowed the pill. As opposed to another type of technology which we observed in our systematic review, digital pills, in which the drug itself is put into a capsule along with a sensor. The sensor becomes active when it senses the change in pH as it's ingested and goes through the digestive tract. So that Bluetooth signal will actually tell you that the drug has been swallowed. So that's what we are meaning here in terms of the difference between a surrogate and a non-surrogate measure. Okay, next slide. Gap number 2, and this has been noted in previous reviews and guidance documents and things like that. We observed that 70% of studies did not describe the biomet in complete detail. So some studies, for example, referred to high-level generic terms like we used a pedometer. Other studies described some information, but not the complete information that would be required in order to reproduce the data and fully understand the adherence metrics. So our next recommendation, again, it's an obvious one, is that we encourage the investigators to describe the biomet manufacturer and model, the software program used, if there is a standalone software program used to analyze the data, and critically the sensors that are contained within the biomet. Recommendation 4 is to also describe the algorithms that convert the sample level data from the sensor into whatever the measurement of adherence actually is. And then recommendation 5 along the same lines is that we encourage investigators where possible to describe or refer to the analytical validation data supporting the adherence algorithm. So again, if we think about a wrist-worn accelerometer, if the tool is saying that the participant used the device or wore the product for 10 hours a day, ideally there would be an analytical validation study demonstrating how we get from X, Y, and Z of an accelerometer at 3 axes through to that measurement of 10 hours per day. Okay, next slide. The third and final gap relates to that complicated figure that I showed earlier. So that is the heterogeneity of adherence definitions that we observed. We encourage investigators that for passive or session-based tools, so these are the tools for which duration of use has some meaning, we encourage investigators to report adherence in units of time. So hours per day, minutes per day, something like that. However, for task-based tools, obviously the duration of use is not meaningful. And so in that scenario, we encourage investigators to report adherence as some kind of continuous variable, like the percentage of tasks completed, for example. Recommendation 8 is that categorical adherence data are reported only in addition to continuous adherence data. And related to that, recommendation 9 is that if investigators do opt to report categorical definitions of adherence, ideally those thresholds will be clinically validated. And we recognize that that's not always going to be the case, particularly early on. But ideally, for example, if an investigator is reporting the percentage of their study sample that used a product for, say, an average of 4 hours per night, there would be some data, some multiple studies demonstrating that 4 hours per night is sufficient to cause a meaningful change in health or quality of life outcomes over time. That's what I'm referring to in terms of clinical validation. Okay, final advancement. I'll just circle back here to our objectives and just re-emphasize that we are focusing on this left-hand arrow. So our hope is that by disseminating these recommendations and seeing them become implemented, that we will address adequate measurement and reporting of adherence. And that is really just the first step. It will ultimately allow us to further our understanding of the determinants of adherence and then continue all the work that's already been done to date, addressing the problem, developing interventions to maximize adherence within a clinical trial and, of course, within usual care. So I would like to finish by just mentioning that the systematic review has been accepted for publication in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, and I believe it is all set to appear online tomorrow. So today's session really couldn't be more perfectly timed. I'd like to thank the support of the Digital Medicine Society as well as all of the investigators that contributed. So we have 16 co-authors in total on this paper. It was a pretty large volume of work, so I acknowledge all of those really valuable contributions. Thank you.
Great.
I believe if we advance one more slide, I'll hand back to Maria.
Yes, thank you so much, Jessie. I think I can, yeah, I've got it. Thank you so much to Jessie, and thank you so much to all of our presenters for those great presentations. Now we will hear from our panelists, and we're happy to have our colleagues from FDA, Michelle Campbell and Annie Saha, with us to share their additional perspectives. So Michelle and Annie, if you're able to, please turn your videos on for your remarks, that'd be great. Michelle, I can turn it over to you to start us off.
Great, thank you, Maria. And I'd like to thank the presenters for their presentations and sharing the work that they are doing. Digital health technologies is an ever expanding field. Just like any technology, it's probably going faster than our own comprehension and understanding of what is happening. So today I'm just going to speak a little bit on more of what I think about the foundational aspects of how to approach the idea of when is it appropriate to select a digital health technology for your trial. And then my colleague from CDRH, Annie Saha, will give a little bit more of the CDRH perspective and the Digital Center of Excellence for Digital Health perspective as well. So I think it's always really important to remember that when we are considering the selection of a digital health technology, that we shouldn't forget our foundational principles of if we are going to be selecting a PRO or clinician reported outcome or any other type of COA that we're used to, that would be a non-DHT base. Those foundational principles are still just as important in selection of digital health technologies. We need to understand, what are we measuring? Is the concept of interest that we want to measure, can that be measured by a digital health technology? We need to make sure we understand the data that's being captured. How do we analyze that data, and how can that data be interpretable? Again, all things that we continually talk about when we're selecting a COA still applies in the digital health technology arena. And so I don't want us to think about it, forget about that aspect, because I think sometimes we're ready to leap to the nice, new, shiny, bright objects sometimes and forget those foundational principles. Because these are the questions that if something was to come in for review, we're going to sit back and look at ourselves. Is the concept important? Does it capture something clinically meaningful? Is this something new that's being captured, or is this improve maybe the quality of a concept that we can capture through other methods? And so those are some of just the basic questions that we'll think about when we see the use of digital health technologies. We know that it's an evolving field, and we're seeing more and more of them being included in our trials right now as exploratory options to support some exploratory endpoints, and are continuing to learn together on how to use digital health technologies. And so what I want to emphasize is that don't forget those principles. We really need to think about this. You know, the tool that you want to use, the digital health technology, really should not be driving what you select. It really still should be driven by, what is my context of use? What is my concept of interest? and is this meaningful to patients, and does it make sense for my clinical trial? I also want to touch on a commentary that myself, Sonia Eremenko, and Lecter Papadopoulos, who really led that effort prior to her leaving the agency, that appeared in a DIA's, I think, weekly or monthly online updates about the work in the pre-competitive space with digital health technologies. And I do believe that digital health technology is an area where pre-competitive work, and some of those examples were given today, is really beneficial. All stakeholders need to learn together, and we need to bring everyone to the table for these discussions, particularly with those considerations from the regulatory perspective and our new guidance that's come out that I know Annie will touch on, but as well as what does our technology experts and our digital health technology folks who are in this every day, how can they help educate us? We still need our clinical trial trialists' thoughts about how would I design this trial. We need our measurement experts to think about how would this measure be able to support an endpoint. So we all need to come together to really think about this work. And obviously the pre-competitive space is probably a really great opportunity for that by working together and advancing the science together. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Annie Saha, to give some additional points as well.
Thanks, Michelle, and absolutely underscore everything Michelle said. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it matters what you're measuring, not how you're measuring it. But digital health technologies do certainly have the promise, especially in the areas of thinking about it from a health equity and trying to get to underserved populations, as well as thinking about having more diverse clinical trials that could be decentralized and really bringing clinical trials to patients. And those are really advantages of using digital health technologies in your clinical trials. And along with that is something you sort of saw in a lot of the presentations, is thinking about ensuring you're looking at different demographics, not just related to sex and gender, but race, ethnicity, ensuring that you're getting to different patient populations so that we can truly understand how a medical product, whether it's a drug or a device or a biologic, is performing, and how the DHT could, or other type of endpoint, could really help measure that. And some additional concepts that we talked about in the draft guidance, along with the main points that Michelle talked about in terms of ensuring that you're measuring the outcome and following all of the steps of clinical outcome assessment, development, evaluation, is that there are some unique considerations for digital health technologies that do need to be thought about when you're thinking about using them in a trial, and thinking about things like the data retention and protection, and of course, privacy, cybersecurity. Those aspects are really critically important to be thinking about upfront before you're thinking about how you're going to use your digital health technology. And of course, thinking about that verification and validation of the digital health technology, thinking about not just the analytical validation, but the clinical validation, especially with all the data that might be generated from the digital health technology, and really determining what's actionable that comes from the digital health technology. And those are the types of things we would really be looking at as part of reviewing a DHT derived endpoint. And I think I can turn it over to the rest of the panel. Maria.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Michelle and Annie. We really appreciate hearing from you both with those additional perspectives. I guess before we get to audience questions, do any of the panelists have a question for one of the other panelists to start us off? And if not, otherwise I will get to, we do have a question. So I guess we'll move on to take some questions from the audience. Panelists, be thinking though in the meantime, in case we have a lull from the audience, if you've got any questions of the other panelists. So now, as all of our presenters turn their videos back on for questions, I just wanted to run through a few reminders. If you would like to ask a question, please click on, well, get to the next slide. Okay, if you would like to ask a question, please click on the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your screen. I will call your name in the order that I see hands raised, and our host will unmute you, and then please make sure you unmute your own phone line as well. Please do tell us your name and affiliation and ask your question to a specific panelist, and then you can lower your hand. Just as a reminder, we do have several hundred attendees in today's session, so we'll get through as many questions as we can. And just based on limited time, we just ask that each person called upon asks one question only and directed to a specific panelist, but I do apologize if we don't get to everybody and we run out of time. So I do have our first question from Pip. Pip, state your name and then clearly ask your question and affiliation, please.
Hi, my name's Pip. I'm from IQVIA, and I've been trying to move into this digital health space for the last couple of years. Unfortunately, I can't comply with your request for a specific panelist, but maybe you can direct that. It's very broadly associated with the general topic of these, what matters to patients. I've been working on a lot of projects recently where we have digital health tools, and there's always a conflict here between, we have lots of data, let's see how this best predicts what's going on in the patient, versus theoretically, what matters to the patient. Let's try and figure out a variable that maps on what matters to the patient. The way I see this is almost like a biomarker versus a digital COA endpoint. And when I think about the biomarker approach, I think about this black box machine learning algorithm approach that puts lots of variables in and gets out a prediction rate. And let's think about it as a prediction of Parkinson's progression, as we've seen today. I think there is a use there for taking lots of variables and putting them together and trying to see if a collection of variables in some way predicts Parkinson's. Now, my question is, in the context of a clinical trial, I can see value definitely for a COA-based endpoint where you specifically find out what is relevant to the patient and choose that and try and model, try and use that as an endpoint. Can you see value for a biomarker-based endpoint where you have a collection of variables and you use machine learning to predict things like progression? Or is that mainly useful for things like real-world studies where you're trying to understand what the population looks like? A very big question there, but I hope you can maybe unpack that.
So Maria, I can attempt to answer Pip's question. It's a little bit of a broad question, and I don't know if we're going to be able to give you the best answer, to be honest. I think something to always think about, no matter if you're talking about a biomarker or COA, is what is the context of use? What do you want to use it for? Even a biomarker has a context of use. And so that, and it's, I would say with a biomarker, you know, sometimes it's even more important. What do you want to do? And so I think you do need to remember the fundamentals of both the biomarker framework and the COA framework when you're approaching digital health technologies. I know that the term digital health biomarkers is out there, but really in the end is, what is my context of use? What is this information going to do? How does this inform me? How does this tell me something about my study population or my trial design or things of that nature? So I go back to those fundamental foundational pieces of what is my context of use type aspect, because even with the biomarker, that is still critical. In any selection that you're going to do, and really, what are you hoping to measure? Again, that concept of interest. So I think those are important, and doesn't matter what you're, you know, if it's a biomarker or a COA approach, it's still that those foundational things are still going to be very critical to really thinking about that right approach. And I'm going to see if Annie has some additional thoughts to add on that.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think we actually put out a commentary in Nature Digital Medicine maybe a couple of weeks ago related to just clarifying biomarker versus COA in a digital context, just so you know, everyone's kind of talking from the same page. And absolutely, ultimately, the end of the day is, what are you trying to measure, and thinking about it from that perspective. And then as far as when you're thinking about it, if it's a machine learning or other type of algorithm, you know, it's going to be important to, again, with an algorithm, understand what is it doing, what are sort of the underlying properties in terms of the measurement, and then thinking about, obviously, that's another space that from the Digital Health Center of Excellence, we're putting a lot of effort into thinking about AI, ML, and how to assess those algorithms, if they're a black box, and understanding what's in them, especially from a transparency perspective. So that way, people who are using those types of technologies really understand what is the purpose and how and what is being measured based on the algorithm.
And I can offer a bit of a sponsor's perspective into the utility of these sort of biomarkers in research. So there's a lot of opportunities to use predictive or prognostic biomarkers to, for example, to select the right candidates for your study, depending on the intervention that you have in mind. And also monitoring safety biomarkers that can be digitally measured can be very important. So especially in diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's, where in Alzheimer's disease it's very difficult to detect the early population that can most benefit from of these early interventions that we have in research. That's where some of these digital biomarkers and digital phenotyping of the population that you want to onboard can be really essential. So that's where there's a lot of utility in these sort of measures.
Been very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying all those points. Thanks.
Great. Well, so I don't see any other audience questions. Do any panelists have any questions of each other at this point while we've got our audience thinking of their next question?
So Bex, can you comment on, in the Watched PD study, how was the difficulty with evaluating fine motor skills in the mobile battery test collection aspect, particularly with movement disorders? And we know the fine motor can be really hard. Can be very hard, and is part of that aspects of the Parkinson's. And additionally, when you were doing this study, was there any minimum cognitive level needed for our study, for the study participants in the Watch PD study?
Yeah, so the part of enrollment was to complete the Montreal cognitive assessment. And it's not a measure I'm particularly personally familiar with, so I can't tell you for certain on the breakdown of the scores, but I do know that the required entry was above the threshold that would define mild cognitive impairment. And then the other thing about that to point out is that, again, this is early stage, early diagnosed, all untreated. So cognitive impairment would not be something you would be, suspecting with this patient population. And then, so Michelle, can you clarify the piece about the motor question that you had?
Sure. Was there, and you may not know this as you're still analyzing the data,
Right.
but was there, how was the approach thinking about knowing that with the motor symptoms and some of these tests that will be detecting fine motor skills, what was some of the thinking about knowing that could present and show, some difficulties in patients being able to complete? I think some of that could be tied to the sensitivity of the DHT and be able to pick up some of that aspect. So you may not know this answer because the data is still being looked at, but do you know what some of the thinking was of how to maybe overcome, but be able to have enough sensitivity of what the device is capturing to be able to capture some of these fine motor skills that we know is a big component in Parkinson's disease?
Right, and I don't know the answer to that because that data has either not been analyzed or hasn't been shared yet. But I know that there's a number of folks on the call attending right now who were integral to the design of those pieces, who would probably be able to speak better to that. But it wasn't what I think the question you're asking wasn't necessarily a focus of the conversation in the interviews with the participants. I think what you're getting at might be something that would be picked up maybe with the actual device data as you look at any potential change that would been observed in that 12 months. So.
Okay, thanks. And I totally understand that. That we're waiting to see what the data looks like from that. So I'm sure there'll be continuing conversations once the analysis has occurred.
Okay, thanks
If
so much for
there-
that
if-
question.
Yeah, Maria, are there questions? If there's no questions, I have a little story I can tell. I want to. It's not really a question, but something I wanted to see if there's a reaction in the panel to the story. But if there's questions, let's take those first.
We actually do have quite a few questions now, but can you hold on to that, Kai, for us? Okay, great. So our next question. Thank you for that last question, and our next question is from Foke. Foke, go ahead. When you can.
Thank you. So yes, hi, this is Volker from AstraZeneca. Very interesting presentations. Thank you very much. I had a question regarding the topic that was about recommendations around collecting, storing, and managing data. All of those separate topics, of course. Would that also naturally lead to at least exploring whether there are principles to follow when it comes to distilling down data? And to give an example, so say you're collecting data from an accelerometer. Well, that's something that isn't measured at a given time point, of course. But even if the recommendation is to collect at least a week's worth of data or at least a month worth of data, when it comes to a clinical trial endpoint, there are numerous ways of distilling that down. So would a consequence of one of these working groups be that there are also either recommendations of what to do or what not to do when distilling down these data into something that can be compared, for example, across treatment groups or even within patients?
Volker, I can at least take a shot at getting that answered for you, although I'm sure the panelists can jump in as well. I think my understanding of your question is, about guidance and recommendations for, how long to measure or how much data, digital data to collect. And I think at the risk of being vague, it really depends on your endpoint. So for example, measuring something like tremor may require, a lot of high frequency data because it's such a small mode of movement, and that at some point you'll run into limitations of battery life and signal connectivity and things like that with that really high frequency data. In contrast to something like sleep efficiency, which is measured over hours and days and weeks sometimes, and therefore the data can be collected from an accelerometer, if that's your sensor, at a much lower frequency. So I think it's ultimately quite hard to put recommendations around, distilling the data as you describe it, because each endpoint will have different requirements.
Oh, that's a really good point. And so allow me to clarify, going with the tremors example. So let's say you see that for a given situation, because as you said, it's very case by case. So for a given situation, for a given patient population and their patterns of tremors, as far as it's known by the clinical community, maybe you assess that you need to measure this for at least 2 weeks to capture the full pattern of tremors. But when it comes to making an endpoint out of this, you can't just say this is 2 weeks of data in one group and 2 weeks of data in another group. Is it a mean across those 2 weeks? Is it a daily mean? Is it an hourly mean? Is it a mean weighted by time of day? So that's the kind of thing. And I would hope it wouldn't be a general recommendation for everyone, but maybe they can be principles to follow when looking at your particular situation. Thank you.
Volker, let me try to make the answer maybe more complete with that input. So that's exactly the kind of definition that we're trying to publish through the DEEP platform. So once we know how those things should be defined, we can publish them and make them available for everybody. So once there's a proven best practice informed by clinicians, informed by patients themselves, then that should be something that is published. So that when we are measuring the same concept, we do that in a consistent and harmonized manner. And also we should kind of get those positions validated with scientific advice and input from the regulators. And we should really do that collectively instead of every individual company coming up with their own definitions. And that will just create a very confusing ecosystem where everybody has their own standards. So these standards, I think, belong to everybody and are pre-competitive, and we should really work together to agree on those kinds of things and publish all of that openly. And that's what we're trying to do through the DEEP initiative. Does that help?
Yes, I consider my question answered. Thank you both very much.
Great, thank you so much for that question. We'll move on to the next one. Jessica, do you want to unmute your line and then feel free to ask your question?
Thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. So I'm Jess Braid. I'm a P-Core scientist within the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research team at Roche. Work quite a lot in the digital health space now as well. And I have a question for the agency in terms of how open you might be to expanding a qualification of a digital health tool or technology to multiple indications or contexts of use. That is to say that if there was a primary indication where the measure had been qualified, and there's there's sufficient supportive evidence available, whereas there's more supportive evidence and less robust evidence in other indications, would that be acceptable, or would the same evidence requirements as for an initial primary application be required for additional indication expansion? I hope that's clear.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, for that question. And it's a great question, and I will always preface with my famous line, it depends, with this. But in general, when we look at the qualification program and trying to do that, you are correct. So traditionally, we would start with a single context of use that is typically tied to something that's more disease specific. I think we understand that in some instances where we have diseases that are similar and can be maybe using similar assessments, is there openness to that? There is a mechanism for adding additional context of uses disease-wise on already qualified COAs. So there is that mechanism if the original submitter actually would like to add on to their context of use for that qualified work. I think if you were starting from scratch and wanted to have that conversation, I think I would take David's advice that he said yesterday and come have a pre-letter of intent meeting with the agency and really kind of explain what the thinking is behind that and what needs to be done. There could be challenges per se in just trying to do what you need to do on a resource issue that may need to be thought about, for example. So I think that would be a conversation we would definitely encourage. This is definitely a great come early and come talk to us moment with that question. These are exactly why we encourage these early conversations. We know that IMI maybe is looking at this a little bit and they're starting with one and then maybe expanding. So I think there is some at least openness to discuss what that would look like. And so if this is something someone wants to really think about some more, again, come early, take advantage of the engagement opportunities that paths that we do have through example, like the pre-LOI meeting, to have those discussions, and we can make sure then we have our correct internal folks and experts there to weigh in on what your thinking is. So it may not be the best answer and the exact answer you're hoping for, but I think that's the best we can say at this point, is to come and talk to us early about something like that.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Okay, thanks again for that question. We may have time for one or two more. Sarah Stothers.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah. I actually work at the FDA in CBER, and I just had a quick question about the qualitative work that is done before we come up with these measures and just ensuring that you have a representative sample. I know there's been some discussion, especially now with the new administration, about health equity and ensuring that these measures include people from different backgrounds, especially with social determinants of health. So I just wanted to ask a few of the presenters if they included these or considered these when they do their studies. Thank you.
I mean, I could just speak to the context of Watch PD. So unfortunately for us, this was the qualitative work that we're doing was post hoc, the Watch PD greater study already occurring. So we did not have that opportunity, but I absolutely 100% agree with you of the importance of doing that and how that is integral to the generalizability of the evidence that you're generating.
I would just add that our first guidance in the patient-focused drug development guidance series, also known as Guidance 1, which was finalized, I want to say maybe a year and a half ago as a final guidance, it does talk about the foundational parts of the qualitative aspect and why it is important to talk to patients early. And so again, this goes back to those foundational aspects of things to consider. And so we want to make sure that, we do have content validity in what we're picking if we're using a digital health technology, like we will with any type of outcome assessment. So that guidance could be a resource for those looking at what would need to be done from the qualitative perspective.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we'll have our last question. Sethu, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, this is Sethu Sankarnarayanan from SK Bio. We are a company focused on Parkinson's disease, and we would like to implement digital wearable endpoints in a decentralized fashion. So one of the challenges we are having is how do we get input from the FDA before we start our trials as to what kind of study design we should use, what kind of analysis we should be doing around in a natural history setting. And I wanted some input also on other clearly defined methods or steps for analytical validation of endpoints, like has been put forth for biofluids, ICH guidelines for biofluids. So I just wanted to try and understand what are the avenues in which a small company which wants to try and do rare disease digital biomarkers in a decentralized fashion, how do we get enough feedback so we don't go about collecting data which may not be acceptable to the FDA at some point down the road. And that is roughly my question. How do we get feedback? How do we make sure that we are doing the right things before we implement a full-scale study in a rare disease population? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So to get that advice would be, for any industry member, sponsor member who wants to do this work, they should be submitting a meeting request for either a pre-IND for the Centers for Drugs and Biologics, or a pre-IDA for CDRH. To have those meetings, this is the perfect time for these type of pre-IND, IDE meetings. These are the conversations we want to have to really think about what is your plan. Is it appropriate? What does that look like? So setting a meeting request to the specific review division that would be doing that work would be really that first part of how to be able to get that advice from the agency. And I'm going to turn it over to Annie to see if she wants to take a stab at the second part of your question.
Sure, and I'll also just add to the first part is that if there's something digital health related, you're welcome to also request the Digital Health Center of Excellence as part of the pre-IND or pre-IDE meeting to sort of answer those targeted questions. And then as far as sort of the analytical validity, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done probably in the broader standards development. But in the draft guidance, we do in section 4C, we do talk through some of the different concepts to be thinking about in terms of verification and validation, interoperability, usability study, and what are some of those different considerations to think about. I'm not going to rattle through all of them, but some of where we've been thinking is in the draft guidance.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. So I think, Michelle, did you have a few final comments you wanted to make before we ended?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to emphasize, and I really appreciate the conversation that we've had today. And I think when it comes to digital health, there are going to be continued and ongoing conversations as we learn, as not only the technology advances, but our familiarity with this technology and how it can help inform us in regulatory decision making. So I see this as one of many continued conversations with stakeholders. I just want to remind folks, we've had some questions and discussions about use and how do we select. And remember, when I talk about the foundational stuff that, really we want to look at what is the important aspect of health that you want to measure with the digital health technology and the content and the concept of interest. There was a question about the qualitative stuff. And I think it's important to remember that we need to make sure we still understand the content validity interpretation based on the work that you're doing. And so, you know, things that are unknown or in that black box, you know, we need to make sure we're understanding what's going on. It's really important because we understand that the clinical validation work can be hard if we have that unknown. So this qualitative work, these foundational pieces are really critical in helping you to be successful in advancing the work you're doing. So I just keep on harping and reminding folks, please don't forget that. We're all really interested to see what our digital health technologies can do, but we shouldn't, you know, get rid of the things that we know work for right now until we learn how, you know, is there ways to improve on some of these foundational things? And we don't know that yet. So let's keep what's working well and it will help us. And I don't know if Annie has any other thoughts as well, but, you know, we look forward to these continued discussions.
Thanks, Michelle. I think you summarized it well, and maybe I'll just underscore the health equity aspect that sort of has come up a few times throughout this, is really thinking about how leveraging digital health technologies can improve health equity, especially in underserved or underrepresented populations, and also think about how we also don't create a larger digital divide than what we currently have in some cases today. And so I'll close with that.
Thank you so much.